For 4 years, I worked as an administrative coordinator making $38K under Greg Patterson, a regional director who treated me like furniture. He'd make me redo work for no reason, say, Eleanor's just here to keep files organized. She's not hello. Jeez. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and I am 32 years old. And 3 weeks ago, I sat in the executive boardroom on the 43rd floor of Ashford Industries, watching the regional operations director, a man named Greg Patterson, present his quarterly report, and halfway through his presentation, I interrupted him and said, Greg, can you pause for a moment? And he stopped and said, yes, Ms. Ashford and I said, I need you to go down to the third floor records room and pull the archived client files from 2019 through 2021 and organize them alphabetically. And he looked confused and said, I'm sorry, what? And I said, I need those files sorted alphabetically by end of day. And he said, Miss Ashford, I'm in the middle of presenting to the board. And I said, I know, and I'm telling you to stop presenting and go sort files. And he said, I don't understand. And I said, Greg, for 4 years, when I worked as an administrative coordinator on your team, you made me stop whatever I was doing to sort your files. And now I'm asking you to do the same. And you're going to do it because I'm the majority shareholder of this company, and my family has owned it for 37 years. And you're going to spend the rest of today doing exactly what you made me do for 4 years. And he went pale, and the room went silent, and I said, I didn't invent this, Greg. I'm just giving you yourself. Let me take you back because this didn't start 3 weeks ago. This started 8 years ago when I graduated from business school. And my father, who built Ashford Industries from nothing, sat me down and said, Eleanor, you're going to run this company one day, but you're not going to do it by sitting in an office. You're going to do it by understanding every single level of how this business operates. And I said, okay. And he said, so you're going to start at the bottom and you're going to work your way up and nobody is going to know who you are. And I said, why? And he said, because people treat you differently when they know you have power. And I want you to see how they treat people when they think they don't. And I said, for how long? And he said, until you've learned enough to earn the chair. And I said, okay. I started as an administrative coordinator in the operations division, making $38,000 a year, and I worked under a regional director named Greg Patterson, who had been with the company for 12 years and had a reputation for being demanding and efficient. And on my first day, he looked at me and said, what's your name? And I said, Eleanor. And he said, Eleanor what? And I said, Eleanor Ashford. And he didn't react because Ashford is a common enough last name, and he had no reason to connect me to the family that owned the building. And he said, okay, Eleanor, you're going to support my team, and that means you do what I tell you when I tell you, and I said, understood. For the first 6 months, Greg treated me like I was furniture. He'd give me assignments without explaining them. He'd change deadlines without warning. He'd ask me to redo work I'd already done correctly, because he decided he wanted it formatted differently. And anytime I asked a question, he'd say, Eleanor, you're an admin. Your job is to execute, not to think. And I'd nod and I'd do what he asked. And I kept a notebook where I wrote down every single task he gave me and every dismissive thing. He said, because my father had told me to document everything. The worst part wasn't the tasks. It was the way Greg talked about me in front of other people. He'd be in meetings with senior staff and he'd say, don't worry, Eleanor will handle the grunt work. Or Eleanor's just here to keep the files organized. She's not part of the strategic conversation. And one time during a presentation I'd helped him prepare, he referenced my work, and when someone asked who put the data together, he said, oh, that was just Eleanor, and he said, just like my contribution. Didn't matter, like I was a tool he'd used and then forgotten, and I sat in the back of that conference room and I smiled and I wrote it down. In year 2, Greg started giving me tasks that were deliberately demeaning. He'd ask me to get his coffee, and when I'd bring it back, he'd say it's cold, get me a new one. Even when it wasn't cold, he'd ask me to organize his files. And then a week later, he'd say, Eleanor, these files are a mess, did you even try? And I'd say I organized them the way you asked. And he'd say, we'll do it again. And I would, and he'd mess them up again, just so he could ask me to redo them. And I realized he was doing it because he could, because I was below him. And he wanted to remind me of that, and I let him. because I was learning that power without accountability turns people into bullies. In year 3, I started attending project meetings because my role had expanded and I was managing schedules and coordinating between departments. And during one meeting, I suggested a process improvement, and Greg cut me off and said, "Eleanor, this is a leadership discussion. If we need someone to take notes, we'll let you know." And the room went quiet, and I said, "I was just trying to help." And he said, "Your help is doing what you're told." And I nodded, and I went back to my desk, and I added it to the list, and the list was getting long. I worked in that division for 4 years, and in that time, I learned how every department operated. I learned who the good managers were and who the bad ones were. I learned which processes were broken and which ones worked. I learned how decisions got made and how information flowed, and I learned that Greg Patterson was not just demanding, he was cruel, and I wasn't the only one he treated that way. I watched him humiliate a junior analyst in front of clients. I watched him take credit for a coordinator's work and then fire her when she spoke up. I watched him build his reputation on the backs of people he considered beneath him, and nobody stopped him because he hit his numbers, and numbers mattered more than people. In year 4, my father called me into his office and said, "Eleanor, you've been down there long enough," and I said, "I think I'm ready." And he said, "What did you learn?" And I said, "I learned that people show you who they are when they think you can't do anything about it." And he said, "Good." And he said, "The board is voting next month to make you chief operating officer, and eventually you'll take over as CEO. And I said, "What about Greg?" And he said, "What about him?" And I said, "He's been running operations for 12 years. And my father said, "And you've been watching him for 4. What do you think?" And I said, "I think he's effective, but he's not good." And my father said, "Then you'll handle it." And I said, "I will." The announcement went out 3 weeks later that I was being promoted to COO, and I walked into the operations division on my first day in my new role, and Greg was standing by his office, and he saw me, and he said, "Eleanor, what are you doing up here?" And I said, "I work here now." And he said, "Doing what?" And I said, "I'm the new chief operating officer." And he laughed and said, "That's not possible." And I said, "It's very possible." And he said, "Wait, you're Eleanor Ashford." And I said, "I've always been Eleanor Ashford. Greg, you just never asked." And he said, "You're serious?" And I said, "Completely serious." And he said, "How long have you?" And I said, "My family has owned this company since 1986, and I've been working here for 4 years, learning how you operate." And he said, "This is insane." And I said, "No, Greg, this is strategic." I didn't fire Greg right away. I didn't demote him or reassign him. I just started managing him the way he'd managed me. I'd ask him to redo reports he'd already completed. I'd change deadlines without warning. I'd ask him to handle administrative tasks that were below his level. And when he'd push back, I'd say, "Greg, your job is to execute, not to question." And he'd stare at me, and I'd smile, and I'd walk away. And I watched him experience exactly what he'd put me and dozens of other people through. And I didn't feel guilty. I felt like I was running an experiment. After 3 months, Greg came to my office and said, "Eleanor, I don't think this is working." And I said, "What isn't working?" And he said, "The way you're managing me." And I said, "Interesting, because this is exactly how you managed me for 4 years. And he said, "That was different." And I said, "How?" And he said, "I was trying to teach you efficiency." And I said, "No, Greg, you were trying to remind me that I was beneath you." And he said, "That's not fair." And I said, "You're right. It's not fair. It's identical." And he didn't have an answer. I kept it up for 6 more months. I made Greg attend meetings where I didn't let him speak. I made him organize files and redo spreadsheets and handle tasks that had nothing to do with his skill set. And every time he complained, I'd reference something he'd said to me years earlier. And I'd say, "Greg, you told me my job was to do what I was told, so that's what I'm asking you to do." And he'd leave my office looking smaller every time. And I watched him go from confident to uncertain to desperate. And I didn't stop because I wanted him to understand what he'd done, not just intellectually, but physically in his body, in his schedule, in the way he felt at the end of every day. Then 3 weeks ago, I called Greg into the boardroom during his quarterly presentation, and I asked him to go sort files, and he looked at me like I'd asked him to set himself on fire. And when he tried to argue, I said, "Greg, this is not a negotiation." And he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Because you spent 4 years treating people like they were disposable, and I want you to know what that feels like." And he said, "I was just doing my job." And I said, "No, you were abusing your position. And now I'm showing you what you did." And he said, "This is revenge." And I said, "No, Greg, revenge would be firing you. This is education." And he left the boardroom and he went down to the 3rd floor. And he spent 8 hours sorting files. And when he came back the next day, he submitted his resignation. And I accepted it. Greg is gone now, and the operations division is being restructured, and I've promoted 3 people who were stuck under him for years. And the culture is changing because I'm not tolerating the kind of behavior I documented for 4 years. And my father asked me if I regret how I handled it. And I said no, and he said why. And I said because Greg spent years making people feel small, and nobody stopped him, and if I just fired him, he would have learned nothing but by making him experience. His own methods, he learned exactly what he did, and my father said, "That's cold," and I said, "It's symmetry." If you've ever worked for someone who treated you like you didn't matter, if you've been dismissed and diminished and told your job was just to do what you were told, I need you to understand something. The people who abuse power do it because they think there are no consequences. And the most effective consequence is not punishment. It's reflection, making them live in the world they created. And if that feels like cruelty, it's not, it's education. And sometimes the only way people learn what they've done is by experiencing it themselves, and you don't have to apologize for that because justice doesn't always look like mercy. Sometimes it looks like a mirror.